Dharane, Nirbhishesha Srinivadi Paskadyade Sakarne. Sorry, I was late. We're going to read today from the Bhagavad Gita, as it is, chapter 4, text number 10. Vidaraga Bhaya Krodha Manmaya Mamupashitya Ahavogana Tapasa Uttamadbhavam Agata. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Being free from attachment, fear, and anger, being fully absorbed in me, and taking refuge in me, many persons in the past became purified by knowledge of me, and thus they all attained transcendental love for me. The prose purport. As described above, it is very difficult for a person who is too materially affected to understand the personal nature of the Supreme Absolute Truth. Generally, people who are attached to the bodily conception of life are so absorbed in materialism that it's almost impossible for them to understand how the Supreme can be a person. Such materialists cannot even imagine that there is a transcendental body which is imperishable, full of knowledge, and eternally blissful. In the materialistic concept, the body is perishable, full of ignorance, and completely miserable. Therefore, people in general keep the same bodily idea in mind when they are informed of the personal form of the Lord. For such materialistic men, the form of the gigantic material manifestation is supreme. Consequently, they consider the Supreme to be impersonal. And because they are too materially absorbed, the conception of retaining the personality after liberation from matter frightens them. When they're informed that spiritual life is also individual and personal, they become afraid of becoming persons again. And so they naturally prefer a kind of merging into the impersonal void. Generally, they compare the living entities to the bubbles of the ocean, which merge into the ocean. That is the highest perfection of spiritual existence, obtainable without individual personality. This is a kind of fearful state of life, devoid of perfect knowledge of spiritual existence. Furthermore, there are many persons who cannot understand the spiritual existence at all. Being embarrassed by so many theories and by contradictions of various types of philosophical speculation, they become disgusted or angry and foolishly conclude that there is no supreme cause and that everything is ultimately void. Such people are in diseased condition of life. Some people are too materially attached and therefore do not give attention to spiritual life. Some of them want to merge into the supreme spiritual cause, and some of them disbelieve in everything, being angry at all sorts of spiritual speculation out of hopelessness. This last class of men take to the shelter of some kind of intoxication, and their effective hallucinations are sometimes accepted as spiritual vision. One has to get rid of all the three stages of material consciousness: attachment to material life, fear of a spiritual personality, personal identity, and the conception of void that arises from frustration in life. To get free from these three stages of the material concept of life, one has to take complete shelter of the Lord, guided by the bona fide spiritual master, and follow the disciplines and regular principles of devotional life. The last stage of devotional life is called bhava, or transcendental love of Godhead. According to the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, 1:4:15-16, the science of devotional service, ado shvara tata sadhusango tya bhajana kriya tato narta nivritti syat tato nishta ruchis tata ata saktis tato bhavas tata preman pujanshati. Sadakanam ayam premna pradur bhave bravakrama. In the beginning, one must have a preliminary desire for self-realization. This will bring one to the state of trying to associate with persons who are spiritually elevated. In the next stage, one becomes initiated by an elevated spiritual master, and under his instruction, a neophyte devotee begins the process of devotional service. By execution of devotional service, under the guidance of the spiritual master, one becomes free from all material attachment, attains steadiness and self-realization, and acquires a taste for hearing about the absolute personality of Godhead, Shri Krishna. This taste leads one further forward to attachment for Krishna consciousness, which is matured in bhava, or the preliminary stage of transcendental love of God. Real love for God is called prema, the highest perfectional stage of life. In the prema stage, there is constant engagement in the transcendent loving service to the Lord. So by the slow process of devotional service, under the guidance of the bona fide spiritual master, one can attain the highest stage, being freed from all material attachment, from the fearfulness of one's individual spiritual personality, and from the frustrations that result in void philosophy. Then one can ultimately attain to the abode of the Supreme Lord. So the verse again. Vita raga vaya kroda manmana mamapashitya ahava jnana tapasa uttamadbhavam agata. Being freed from attachment, fear, and anger, being fully absorbed in me and taking refuge in me. Many persons in the past became purified by knowledge of me, and thus they all attained transcendental love for me. Om Agyanatimirandasya Gananjana Salakaya Chaksura Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. This verse comes after a very famous verse, verse number 9, which is known as the Pratibhasha Sloka in the Bhagavad Gita. Pratibhasha Sloka means it's the verse which all the other verses in Bhagavad Gita depend upon or take reference from. That verse is Janma Karma Chame Divyam Evam Yoveti Tatvataha Tyaktva Deha Punarjanma Naiti Mam Eti Sorjana. That one who knows about the transcendental nature of my appearance and activities does not, upon leaving the body, take birth again in this mature world, but attains my eternal abode, or Arjuna. So now Krishna is explaining what the qualifications are to understand the transcendental nature of his appearance and his activities. Generally speaking, Krishna's manifestation in the material world is done quite expertly. Although we're an illusion, we don't really think we're an illusion. We think that we're in reality, and that the description, every other description, is whatever it be, which doesn't fit into our present reality. We consider that to be an illusion. In other words, the virtual reality that Krishna creates by his Maya is perfect. It's so perfect that even if we go from one experience or one conception of reality to the next, we think that at every point we're in reality, even though at every point we may be an illusion. Just like if someone takes intoxication and enters into another kind of reality, one thinks that at that moment that reality is true and forgets about the previous reality that one was experiencing. Therefore, generally speaking, we have theoretical knowledge, and then we have perspective. In other words, anyone in the material world is not satisfied with their present reality. That's why people are always doing things to enter into another reality. That no one is thinking, I'm so happy that my life is perfect. Everyone is thinking that there must be something more that I can do to make my life happier. And indeed, everyone is advertising and giving testimony about how they did this, or bought that, or thought about this, and how they became eternally full of bliss and knowledge. When they bought those pair of shoes and they put them on, they felt that they were floating in outer space instead of walking. And of course, people think, well, let me go and buy them and put them on and see if I can also float in outer space. And generally, much to people's disappointment, although everything is advertised in terms of a higher experience, but often it's not really a higher experience. It's a different experience. And for some people, that different experience may seem like a higher experience, especially if they're in association with others who have a similar experience. There's one of Srila Prabhupada's disciples, and Hari Saripur, his wife, and she was describing in some talk she's giving how when she was a devotee, new devotee, then she was going to get married to another devotee, Narottammananda Prabhu. Great cook, Narottammananda Prabhu. And this is one of the arranged marriages in the Hare Krishna movement at that time. But I was also married for 2 weeks in the movement. And the day of the marriage, I met my wife. Anyhow, it's not a long story, so I won't even bother telling it. In any case, Harish, this particular Mataji, wasn't even initiated at that time. Her name was Bhakta Susan. And she was, at that time, marriages were quite simple. But she was going to go and buy something for her new husband. So she went to the shop to buy it, but on the way, she stopped in at her brother's house. And there in her brother's house were all her old friends, and they were all smoking like marijuana, I guess. So she was talking to them, trying to preach to them, telling about her new found religion, the Hare Krishna movement, and what the philosophy was. And they were passing around some marijuana and everyone was smoking it. So she was only in the movement for a couple of weeks, or a few months actually. And it was just a sociable thing to do. She didn't think very much of it. Although I'm sure she knew the regular principles, but it was a social thing. The friends were all doing it, so she also participated. But then she actually experienced how her consciousness was going down, and her whole consciousness became cloudy, and she couldn't really communicate very well. So what she thought was bliss previously, in a higher state of consciousness, stay high forever, now is horrible to her. She actually experienced her consciousness going down rather than up, although previously she thought her consciousness was going up. but now compared to Krishna consciousness, she felt it was going down. So similarly, unless we get higher consciousness, then whatever consciousness we're on, we think is higher. And indeed, it may be higher than our lower state of consciousness, but compared to a normal state of consciousness, it's actually not what we expect or what we think. Therefore, in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, where Arjuna asked Krishna, now I know what I'm supposed to do in the material world, but I don't do it. Why don't I do it? So then Krishna says, Kama Esha to Arjuna, Kama Esha, Krodha Esha, Rajaguna Samudbhava, Ahashano Mahapatma, Vidinam Ihavarina. That is lust only, Arjuna, which is born in the mode of passion, and later transformed into wrath, which is the all-devouring sinful enemy of this world. So, Krishna tells Arjuna the reason why is that we're being directed by our senses and our mind. Now, for a conditioned soul, that's completely normal. When it's time to go to sleep, we don't think, this is so strange. I have to go to sleep. I don't want to go to sleep. I'm not going to go to sleep. I'm going to stay up forever. For most of us, we think, oh, this is fantastic. I can enter into Never Never Land. It doesn't seem at all abnormal to enter into the region of unconsciousness. And what to speak of other states of consciousness. Therefore, Krishna says, Dumena Vriyate Varnir, Hitardar Shomalena Cha, Hitobena Avrita Garabas, Tata Tenedam Avrita. This is chapter 3. Let's see, what is the text of that? Oh. Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3.
Maharaj, you can tell also about your marriage. It sounds interesting.
It wasn't very interesting. Let's just say that, as Japatak Maharaj once told me, he said, she wanted romance and I wanted to read the Bhagavad Gita. So it didn't work out very well. Oh, here we go. Text 38, chapter 3, text 38. As far as fire is covered by smoke, as the mirror is covered by dust, or as the embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust. So normally we don't walk around and think, well, I'm covered by lust, and therefore that's why I see things as I see things. No, everyone thinks, actually, what I see, the way I see things is the way everyone should see things. And even in Krishna consciousness, when we get a little realization, we think, now I understand everything. Therefore, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says in the Madhurya Kandambini, that in the stage called Madhyama Sadhana Bhakti, the beginning of it, he mentions that there are different stages of what's called Anishnata Bhajna Kriya. Anishnata means unsteady Bhajna Kriya, execution of sadhana. And the first stage is called Utsaha Mayi. Utsaha means enthusiasm. So we believe when we first come, especially Krishna gives us some extra mercy, because otherwise, how can we get out of our material destinations, we could say, or how can we get out of our current path in material existence, unless we got some special mercy, generally speaking, to give us a different perspective on reality. So, generally speaking, many devotees experience some higher taste, some causeless mercy coming from transcendence. And immediately one believes that one is self-realized. One is full of enthusiasm, a new life, a new reality, a new experience. And at first, devotees are very enthusiastic to tell everyone about it, especially our parents, to get them out of Maya, because they generally don't understand. As a matter of fact, the more we try to explain to them our transcendental experience, the more they become concerned with our welfare. If we didn't say anything, we'd probably get along with them better, but we were intent in saving them also. In any case, we have our newfound reality, and we're convinced that everyone else should accept our reality and follow us sincerely, carefully, because now we know everything, and they don't know anything. Perfect combination for problems with our previous people that we dealt with, especially our parents. The brahmachari going home for the first time, and the mother rushes to the brahmachari to greet him, and the brahmachari with his shaven head and robes on immediately puts his hand out and says, "Stop, Mom, don't touch me." She says, "Why not? You're a woman, don't touch me." And the mother goes, "What? What did they do to you?" "I'll explain it to you, Mom. Sit down. You're in Maya. I gotta help you." What? So this is called Utsahamai, that we're on top of the world. We're here to save the world. The only problem is that the world doesn't want to be saved. So that goes on for some time. One can even see the older devotees and think, well, they're so unfortunate. They're not as enthusiastic as I am. Somehow or another, they didn't get the mercy of Krishna as I did. Why aren't they as enthusiastic as I am? So then after some time of trying to execute sadhana bhakti, the next stage is Tara Gana Tarala, alternating thick and thin. And one suddenly gradually realizes that one is not a perfect devotee. That one has one's times of enthusiasm and sometimes times of less than enthusiastic devotional service. So that's good. One becomes a little humble and starts realizing that we're in Maya, that we're actually under the spell of the illusory energy, and that our present conceptions are not reality. Our present conceptions are due to our being covered by the modes of material nature. and that by devotional service, certainly we become enlivened and enlightened to some degree. We are transformed from the mode of ignorance to the mode of passion to the mode of goodness in a gradual way. And at each stage of that transformation, we may believe that what I've been transferred to is reality, but actually we're simply gradually being transformed from complete ignorance of identifying ourselves with the gross and subtle body to identifying ourselves as Krishna's servants, our actual identity. So here in this particular verse, it mentions that an ordinary person in conditioned life, being covered by ignorance, thinks that there's nothing beyond matter. When they talk about spirit, they generally talk about the mind. They think the highest realm, they think spiritual means the mind. They have no conception of a spiritual identity, of even consciousness. So therefore, their religions, they talk about the spirit and about the spirit has been liberated, but they're really talking about the mind. And for that reason, they cannot understand that animals can have souls, that animals are conscious like we are, because they think consciousness is really product of the mind, rather than the consciousness. The soul has consciousness. The soul is completely apart from both the gross and the subtle body. Therefore, in reality, they're materialists, although they have some belief in God, but their actual realization is rather mundane, with some idea that they're the person who's controlling, giving good and bad results, but not very clear about what the spiritual world is like. They think the spiritual world is the place where you're given a harp or a horn to play eternally if you're a good person. And if you're not a good person, then God picks you up and throws you into the burning fire. And then you just burn forever. Eternal barbecue. And everyone else is just sitting there playing, God is great, God is great, God is great. So this is rather a mundane conception of life. And there are some who are so-called transcendentalists. They understand that we're not the body to some extent. They have enough intelligence due to becoming elevated by some purificatory process, that leads to the mode of a little bit of mostly passion with a little goodness. And they can understand that the body's changing, but the self is not changing. But they have no conception of the fact that the soul is an individual person, because they have really no conception of who they really are. They just know they exist. They know they're conscious, and they can see others are conscious too, and they think everyone is one. Anything that has consciousness is one, just manifested in different varieties in the material world, in different material bodies. So they think there's one consciousness manifested in a variety of illusory bodies. And they can see that their consciousness, when it's manifested in varieties of bodies, all people do is fight with each other and exploit each other in the material existence. Then in the name of society, friendship, and love, as Prahlad Maharaj said to Nrsingadev, or explained that he wasn't interested in a benediction because he didn't want to be a businessman. So material life generally means doing business with others. I scratch your back 3 times, and I expect you to scratch my back 4 times. So I make 1 scratch profit. And if you scratch my back only 2 times, then next time I'm going to scratch your back once to get even with you. And that way we have a reciprocal relationship. So what goes on in the name of love in the material world is generally just business. Now, to conceive of something beyond material experience, theoretically, we can do that if we hear from higher sources. But generally speaking, people are limited to the conception that if they're on a higher level of consciousness, that they're not their body, at least theoretically. And therefore, they conceive of spiritual life as something like merging, where everyone who's already one realizes that we're all one, and therefore our differentiations that have been manifested in terms of different bodies and minds and conceptions and moods and everything else disappears. And then we all become one and live peacefully because we're all the same. But the idea that we are liberated from this body and go back to a spiritual world, they think there, if we're in our spiritual body and we have the same propensities we have now, then we're going to wind up fighting with each other eternally in the spiritual world instead of temporarily in different bodies here. Or they're going to give me some service there to do eternally that I don't like. I wind up in the kitchen in the spiritual world forever, washing pots. Everyone else is dancing and taking prasadam, and I'm just in the kitchen forever washing pots. Or I go there and I'm a blade of grass in the spiritual world, and the only service I have is that people step on me eternally. And as soon as I complain or try to complain, then I'm threatened by being put back into the material world again. I have to stay there forever being stepped on. So people, for this concept, without understanding spiritual life, people are fearful. It's bad enough here fighting with people, but if my worst enemy, myself, that I have, my worst enemy and myself, wind up in the same part of the spiritual world, and I have to fight with them forever, it's going to be very unpleasant. So without at least a perspective that spiritual life is different from material life, then people are not really interested in real spiritual life. If they think that God is an old person who has, somehow or another, he's so old, as one rabbi said, his name was, by the way, was Krishna, Rabbi Krishna. He explained why bad things happen to good people. His explanation was that actually God is a nice person, but he's become so old that he's become senile. And therefore he doesn't know really what he's doing anymore. So for that reason, sometimes bad things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people. But what can you do? He's trying the best he can. But the rumor is that one of the younger angels will take over soon. The old man will retire, and therefore things should go better in the future, hopefully. So with such a conception of life, God is not very attractive. As Michelangelo painted God in the Sistine Chapel as an old man, because he's the oldest, with his hand out, trying to clutch the man on the earth, but his hand is shaking because he has arthritis, because he's so old. Not a very attractive idea. But to hear that God is a cowherd boy in Vrindavan, and that, what does he do? He herds cows, and he plays his flute, and he dances with his boyfriends and girlfriends, and he eats butter. He's not even a vegan. People start wondering, what? Even when we were intoxicated, we didn't imagine things like that. That's too far out. That's too different from our present experience. That God has unlimited cows in the spiritual world. And for the Christians, they think he doesn't even eat meat. Why does he have so many cows for? What does he do with them? And if he has so many cows, for those who don't eat meat, they think, but he drinks milk. Doesn't he know it's unhealthy? After so many eternal years, doesn't he realize that milk is just for the calf? So it's very difficult to understand Krishna, to get a perspective. Therefore, Bhagavad Gita, Krishna doesn't talk very much about himself. He does explain about how we're not this body, and how there's a super soul within the heart who can guide us, who gives us every living entity remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness. And if we ask for guidance how to get out of the bodily concept of life, he'll help us out with that. God is there helping us get free from our misconceptions. And that ultimately there is a person called Bhagavan, which if one is inclined, one can study that further. Because Prabhupada in his purports describes Krishna very nicely as a cowherd boy in Vrindavan, holding a flute, with glowing eyes like lotus petals, and his mother Jasoda is there. So Prabhupada he goes directly into explaining about who Krishna is, even in the Bhagavad Gita. Otherwise, most people read the Bhagavad Gita, impersonalists comment, and they think it's a very nice book. We're not the body, we're eternal. God has expanded himself as a super soul, and me and God are one. So everything's all right. And from people's perspective, some people will make sense. For a materialist, it won't make any sense whatsoever in the Bhagavad Gita, or something will be found there that may make sense to them, but generally they won't understand it because they're not qualified to understand it. As Sitala, this Mataji's name is, a disciple of Srila Prabhupada, she was explaining that when she grew up, she read all kinds of books. Her family had a bookshelf there. Her mother loved to read books, and she read books all the time. And she got a copy of Bhakti Godhead one time in the course of her association with devotees. She was in a room full of Bhakti Godheads. She tried to read them, but she couldn't understand what they were talking about. It was just too difficult to understand. If she picked up an ordinary book, it was very simple to understand. But to read a Bhakti Godhead was practically, whether she read it up the right way or upside down, it made about the same sense to her. Or as Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami had explained in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, now I'm explaining the most esoteric philosophy. What's going to happen if people take this up and read it? What are they going to think? And then in the next verse he says, well, it won't matter what they think because we won't understand it at all. When Krishna says this is the most secret of all secrets, it's a secret because unless one performs devotional service, it's inconceivable what Krishna is talking about. it's just not within the realm of a conditioned soul's experience or even conception. One cannot read Bhagavad Gita without some pious activities and get anything substantial from it that will help one come to the platform of personalism, at least. Generally, in current society, there is some piety in general, because there's still some spiritual conceptions coming from the previous religions that people had some association with, or society had some influence over, whether it be Christianity or Mohammedanism or even Buddhism. Has created some piety within society so that people can understand very simple things. But the piety required to get a perspective on something transcendental as Krishna consciousness, as Krishna's essential nature, and the essential nature of spirit is just beyond people's present piety. They're too covered over by the modes of material nature. And therefore, to expect them to understand what we're talking about when we express ourselves, for most people, it's practically impossible to even begin to imagine what we're talking about. As Srila Prabhupada, when he was speaking to Professor Kataski, first of all, he tried to explain to him that Professor Kataski was the professor at the University of Moscow that invited Prabhupada to come to Russia. So Prabhupada was grateful to him and went to meet him at the university one time and tried to explain something what we were doing. Now, Prabhupada started with an explanation of how we're not the body. And Professor Kataski could not understand at all what Prabhupada was talking about. So then Prabhupada tried to explain to him that at least within the society, we should try to develop first-class men or women. And Professor Kataski couldn't understand what Prabhupada was talking about. Truthfulness, cleanliness, what is the value of these things? That everyone was supposed to be the same. There's no first-class men. Everyone is supposed to be fifth class. So then Prabhupada asked Professor Kataski, because he saw he wasn't getting anywhere in the conversation, couldn't you get me a taxi? And Professor Kataski said, so sorry, can't do that either. Can't do that. So Prabhupada had to go out in the street with Shyamasundara looking for a taxi. It wasn't that Professor Kataski was an evil person. It's just that although he was supposedly familiar with the Vedic culture because he was the head of the Vedic department in Russia, but it was just beyond his conception. Or in Detroit, when one professor came to Prabhupada to see him in Detroit, he was professor of Indology at the university there. So the first question this professor asked Srila Prabhupada was, can you tell me what Hinduism is? Prabhupada was quite bold. So he said to this particular professor, he said, you're a professor of Indology, which means professor of studying Hinduism, and you're asking me what the definition of Hinduism, and you're supposed to be professor of it? So then he probably turned to Swarup Damodar Maharaj, who had a PhD in chemistry. And he said, Swarup Damodar Maharaj, at that time he was a Prabhu, he said, here's a professor of Indology at a big university, and he's asking me what the definition of Hinduism is. What do you call that? So then Swarup Damodar Prabhu said, he's a cheater, Prabhupada, he's a cheater. So the point is that most people are walking around, well, everyone is walking around the material world, covered by the modes of material nature, and given a perspective according to those modes. It's just natural. And within those modes of nature, there's a limit to what our experience is and what we can even conceive, because there's nothing to relate it to. Everything we hear, everything we experience, we relate it to something. And if we have a constrained level of experience and conceptions, then what's actually being said is just beyond our experience and our conception. And therefore, we just take it in according to our own personal experience and conception. And we think that's what it is, what's actually being talked about. Luckily, in Bhagavad Gita, there's something for everyone. And therefore, there is some path for everyone given in Bhagavad Gita. For the karmi, there is karman yeva dakaraste ma paleshu kadachna. You have a right to perform your prescribed duty, but you're not entitled to the fruits of action. So for the karmi doesn't mean vikarmi. Most people are vikarmis. And therefore, they want to understand what Krishna is talking about. Duty. What are you talking about, duty? My duty is to make money for my family and put some food on the table, and then we eat it, and then we go to sleep. That's my duty. There's no such thing as duty for the materialistic person. But in the Vedic culture, there's jnanis also. And therefore, bhavanam janamanam ante jnanamam prapadyate vasudeva sarvamiti. If you keep on studying the Vedas, then one day you'll realize Krishna is everything. Vasudeva sarvamiti. And for the yogi, there's yoginam api sarvesham madgatenandaratmana. That of all the yogis, the one who thinks about me within himself and renders transcendental loving service, he's the best of all the yogis. And then for the aspiring bhakta, Krishna says, Maya Sakta Manak Partha Yogam Yunjan Manashaya. Hear about me and practice yoga in full consciousness of me. With mind attached to me, then you can know me in full, free from doubt. So there's something for everyone, all the transcendentalists in Bhagavad Gita. But if one cannot understand Bhagavad Gita, it's just beyond their ability to conceive what Krishna is talking about, even from the point of duty or spiritual knowledge or meditation. Then one is offered prasadam. That rather than try to explain to people concepts that are just beyond their imagination, therefore we give them prasadam in the holy name. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, when he introduced Krishna consciousness to the masses, he only chanted Hare Krishna and distributed prasadam. He didn't discuss philosophy so much. Of course, we distribute books, and there are pious people out there who previously have performed devotional service in previous lifetimes, and they'll understand something and become inspired by it. But most people will take it as just an ordinary book talking about, Dharma Kshetra, Kurukshetra, Samaveda Yutsavaha. They told me this book was about how it would help my career in chemistry, and that this is a perfect book for me. And I can't even understand the first word that what this book is about. It doesn't seem to be like about chemistry. It's about some battle on a Kurukshetra. It's in Sanskrit. What are they talking about? No, most people will not find it very easy reading, especially the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita. They'll wonder, what is this about? Still, eventually, if they get by good fortune, the devotees have a program of chanting Hare Krishna and distributing prasadam, and try to explain to people personally, according to their particular level of consciousness, what Bhagavad Gita means, then they might eventually understand something, especially they become pious or they gain pious activity by chanting Hare Krishna and by taking prasadam and by associating with devotees. Then a path towards progress in actual spiritual life is possible. But we shouldn't think that just because people read the book, they're going to get the same understanding that we have when they read it. Everyone who reads the book will get an understanding according to their level of consciousness, according to their conditioned experience. Therefore, to help ourselves, we need the association of devotees especially superior, so that we can discuss our conceptions with others, with superior devotees, with devotees on the same level that we are on, so we can help each other, clarify things. And then we have to help devotees who have less experience than we have, and try to help them explain to them our experience, our conception, but not that we have the absolute truth and that everyone else is bogus. That we know everything because we're devotees and no one else knows anything. When Narada Muni explained to Vyasadeva about his previous life's experience, he was quite humble and explained how by the mercy of the Bhaktivedantas and by taking some of their remnants of prasadam and hearing them hearing and chanting, he became purified enough to follow the process. So that holds true for all of us. By some inconceivable mercy, we have the association of devotees, and we've developed a taste for hearing and chanting about Krishna. And humbly, because that's what we're trying to develop, is humility. Humbly, we're trying to learn to become tolerant. The hardest thing to be tolerant is of our own mind, because our own mind will concoct ideas, who's a good person in the material world and who's a bad person, who we can criticize and who we can praise, which is all right. We need that discrimination, but we should also understand that that's not the highest conception. The highest conception is developed through appreciation of those who are engaged in devotional service and trying to see how people are being guided by the super soul. That there's not good people in the material world, there's not bad people in the material world. There are conditioned souls who are good and bad to different degrees, being directed or misdirected by the illusory energy, or to some degree being directed by Krishna. And therefore, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, if we want to get to a higher consciousness, then we have to treat everyone as Krishna's eternal servant and try to gain the intelligence by which we can help them make progress in devotional service. There are good and bad people according to the good is material mode of goodness, badder is ignorance and passion. But still, actually, they're souls. We're all souls. And the whole idea is to help people realize their spiritual identity, not realize how they're good or bad. Although that may be there, we want to encourage people to come to the mode of goodness, because then it's easier to understand what actually is reality in the mode of goodness. In ignorance and passion, it's practically impossible to understand reality. But our business is to help people get out of the modes of nature, come to goodness, so they can understand what Krishna is talking about in the Bhagavad Gita. So gradually these conceptions that Krishna has given, one will be able to perceive them, have a perspective on them, then by experience become convinced of them by their own personal experience, and then realize that the real progress towards eternal life is developing the skill of how to become a pure devotee of Krishna. And by developing that skill, then one develops the character of a pure devotee. And then if one has the character of a pure devotee, then everything was revealed to one. Krishna reveals himself to one who has the same character that he has, simply loving devotion towards not only Krishna, but towards all living entities. And Krishna reveals himself gradually in that way. So our business is to become more, hear about Krishna, hear the philosophy, gradually try to perceive it to the best of our ability, and then apply it within our lives with some conviction. And as we understand that the real application is to develop loving exchanges with the devotees on different levels, then gradually we'll develop the character of a pure devotee who's always engaged in loving service to Krishna and loving service to everyone and everything in relationship to Krishna. Then everything will be not only theoretically understood, but experienced in Krishna consciousness. So here Krishna is explaining about the different misconceptions, but the emphasis here is engaging in devotional service. And by engaging in devotional service, gradually these misconceptions will go away. Just like when the fog is there, it's very difficult to get rid of it. But when the sun comes up, then the sun will burn away all the darkness of the fog. So similarly, when Krishna arises within our heart, then all these misconceptions will go away. And in the meantime, we should understand that we have these misconceptions to different degrees, and we have to understand that we're under the spell of the illusory energy, and therefore we shouldn't take them as the purpose of our life, or to become discouraged by them, or become confused by them. We should understand that this is just our present state of existence. But if I take to devotional service, then gradually these things will go away. Krishna, Nitya Siddha Krishna Prema Sadhu Kava Yunoi, Shravanadi Shuddha Chiti Kare Udoy. That love for Krishna is within our heart. We're all perfectly capable of loving Krishna. That's our natural experience. We're all Nitya Siddhas. We're not part of the material world. We all have Krishna Prema naturally. Just like when the spark is out of the fire, it doesn't glow very much. But as soon as it's back in the fire, then it glows very nicely. So now we're outside of Krishna consciousness, we have problems. And as soon as we're back in Krishna consciousness, then there's no more problems. So Nitya Siddha Krishna Prema Sadhu Kavanoi Shravanadi, just by hearing about Krishna and then by applying it within our lives to the best of our ability, then gradually love for Krishna will arise within our heart and our lives will become successful. And that's true for everyone. We actually have the solution for everyone's problems. It's not what people think, but it's actually the real solution. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Indira.
Харе Кришна. Могу по-русски спросить?
По-русски. Конечно.
Да. Махарадж, скажите, пожалуйста, вот у меня есть теоретическое понимание, я согласна, что я не тело. То есть я помню себя там, когда мне было 10 лет, 20 лет и сейчас. То есть в теории я согласна, что я не тело. А вот как хотя бы в теории согласиться, понять, что я не ум?
Maharaj, I will translate for the English speaking, right? It's okay?
Конечно, пожалуйста.
Okay. Yeah. So Maharaj, theoretically, I do understand that I am not this body because I remember myself at 2 years old or 10 years old. I understand theoretically I'm not this body. How do I theoretically start to understand that I'm not this mind either?
Well, which mind? How many minds have you had? Was your mind the same when you were 2 years old? Is it the same when you were, is it going to be the same when you're 95 years old? So which mind are you talking about? Now, the way we realize everything, including the fact that we're not this body, is to engage the body and our mind and our words in Krishna's service. So for the mind, we have to put the mind into the mode of goodness. Because if the mind is in the mode of ignorance and passion, then we don't understand about the mind because we're in ignorance and passion. But when the mind is in goodness, then it becomes clear who we are. And when the mind is in ignorance and passion, then the mind will confuse us. Because if the mind is in ignorance and passion, it takes away our intelligence. And when our intelligence is taken away, then we can't understand anything properly. But we understand things according to whatever intelligence is left over once the mind takes it away. Or as Krishna says, while contemplating the objects of the senses, a person develops attachment to them. From such attachment, lust develops. From lust comes anger. From anger comes illusion. From illusion comes bewilderment of memory. When memory is bewildered, intelligence is lost. And when one falls into the material pool. So the way we understand we're not the mind is the opposite. We use our intelligence to put the mind in Krishna, so we get out of illusion, and gradually lust, anger, greed, they diminish, and then we can see things clearly. And one of the things we can see is that we're not the mind, nor our conceptions, material conceptions, nor are we the false ego. So those things will be revealed to us as we become purified. Prabhupada gives the example of a coconut. If the coconut is unripe, then if you shake it, you can't hear anything. But when the coconut becomes ripe, the inside of the coconut falls out. And therefore, when you shake the coconut, you can hear the inside because it's separated from the coconut. So when our mind, senses, intelligence, and everything is fixed in Krishna consciousness, then we'll fall out of material conceptions of life. And we won't identify ourselves at all, either with our previous gross body, or with our subtle mind, or with our material conceptions, nor with our false ego. We'll be situated in our real identities, with our spiritual body, with our spiritual mind, with our spiritual intelligence, with our spiritual identity. So that takes some time. In the meantime, Krishna suggests we don't follow the dictations of the mind. We follow his dictations. We find out what Krishna wants. And then when these thoughts come through our mind, then we pick out what thoughts are actually in relation to Krishna consciousness, and we follow them, rather than thoughts which are flowing through our mind, which are offering us some opportunities for different types of material experience. As Krishna says, apurimanam achala pratishtam, that one who's not attached to the incessant flow of desires that enter like rivers into the ocean, which is always being still, which is always being filled, but is always still, can alone achieve peace, and not the man who strives to satisfy such desires. So as our mind becomes more conscious of Krishna, then other thoughts that go through our mind, we won't take seriously. They'll come and go. And when they come and go, and we become purified of those thoughts, then everything will be seen more clearly. As the contamination of material existence is dissipated by association with Krishna, ever deepening association with Krishna, then everything is seen ever more clearly, including the difference between ourselves and other things that we identified with ourselves previously. It's called realization. Is that all right? Patience. Therefore, we're given names like Dasi, Dasa, so that we think ourselves to be Krishna's servant, rather than this body or even the mind, or even our conceptions. We just think ourselves Gopi Bharata Pada Kamalayora Dasa Dasa Anudasa. As I'm the servant of the servant of the servant of Krishna, that's all we need to know, and our lives will become perfect in Krishna consciousness. There's one question here. How do we know what we'll achieve? How will we know that we achieve the mode of goodness? Well, if you don't know that you've achieved the mode of goodness, you must be in ignorance. It's like the example is given. How do we know that we eat a meal? Do we need a certificate? No, we know we've eaten a meal, Bhakti Pareshanu Vyaktir, Anyata Trika Ekakala, because with every bite we take, we feel satiation of our hunger. Similarly, we get growing strength and we become detached from growing strength, hunger, alleviation of hunger, and satisfaction with every bite we take. Similarly, by practicing Krishna consciousness, as we come closer to the mode of pure goodness, including goodness, then gradually we're able to see everything more clearly in relation to Krishna, everyone and everything. And at the same time, we develop feelings of love towards everyone and everything in relation to Krishna. And number three, we become detached from the things that draw our minds away from Krishna. So that's how we can judge that we're coming to goodness. Because in goodness, there is we understand reality, we have the perspective of it, on it. And therefore we develop gradually all the good qualities that Krishna has by association with him. And everything is understood properly. Our feelings become good towards everyone and everything. And we become detached from things that are bad, that are not in relation to Krishna or Krishna's service. So that's called goodness. Okay. Thank you very much. Grandaraj Bhagavad Gita ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.